So welcome everybody to our end of year event and Ask Me Anything plus a discussion of the book Mindset by Jackie Reardon and Hans Deckers. And as Josh just suggested, we're going to start with the book, and maybe some other people can trickle in as we go along. So I don't know, Josh, if anybody else has read the book, if Paula has read it,
Brian,
or
did
No,
we
I have
record,
not.
by the way? Oh, you did record. Sorry.
yes, yeah. So Paula has not read it. I don't know if your parents have read it. Probably
I'm
not,
I'm
but
looking for it. I'm looking for it on Kindle now. I think you mentioned it one of your morning, or listened to you in the morning, and I think I looked for it at that point. But a good reminder. Thank you so much.
sure. Um, And I don't even know how I found this book, Josh, but when I finally decided to read it, it was very impactful to me as one of the better, this is my opinion, one of the better mental training books for tennis. Even though the title refers to sport, Jackie Reardon was a player herself, and has been a coach. And so that was like my initial impression after reading it. Like, wow, this is one of the more detailed mental training books for tennis out there. There's not a lot of just sort of overview, general sort of platitude kinds of things. Lots of good, specific, useful, practical things that one can do to improve, uh, your mental game. So I'm just curious what your initial impressions were, once you read the book.
Totally. I mean, I think, yeah, first of all, her background is definitely relevant. And the fact that she had, had played tennis at quite an elite level, and then, went into this field of mental training. And yeah, I think what I liked about it is she really approached things in a different way. I think, certain books overlap in terms of some of the content or in terms of maybe sometimes how that content is presented, where I think Jackie and Hans really went about it in a different way by sort of introducing novel concepts, new concepts, or maybe the same types of concepts, but maybe giving them different names.
Yeah.
Talking about story thinking and action thinking, talking about this idea of friendly eyes, talking about approaching things with curiosity. And I would say, one of the big themes, I think, I think a lot of it sort of stems from Buddhism and stems from mindfulness in a lot of ways, just in terms of sort of the approach that they take. But I thought it was really great. I would say one of I think there were different takeaways that I had. I think one of the biggest takeaways was sort of this process of going, going from somebody who is maybe just starting a sport or just starting an endeavor to the expert, and sort of the that journey, and sort of going from this point of what they refer to as unconscious incompetence, where you're starting that journey to um to unconscious competence, where there's a step where you're getting better, you're improving at your skills, but you're not necessarily conscious or aware of why that is, and you can't necessarily maybe define it or label it or explain what's different. And because of that, you're still not necessarily at the point of fully grasping some of the ideas or understanding maybe why you've made the improvements. You've maybe improved because of that repetition or because of the work and time that you've put into it, but maybe still aren't fully conscious about some of the larger concepts about the game. So that would be step two. So starting with sort of that point of unconscious incompetence, then getting to that point of unconscious competence, and then getting to
I think it's
conscious.
actually, isn't it conscious incompetence?
Am I mixing it up? Okay,
Yeah.
so conscious incompetence is number two. Okay, so
Yeah.
where we're aware that we're still not fully there with our game, but we're at least building that awareness is step two. Thank you. And then step three being sort of unconscious
Or actually,
competence.
conscious competence.
Con-
Yeah, because
conscious,
unconscious
oh, right.
competence is like you don't even think
Yes,
about it, right?
exactly. So thank you. definitely mix that up a bit there. But step 4, which is the step we ultimately want to get to, is
Right.
the step of unconscious competence, where we don't have to be thinking about it. We don't have to be necessarily thinking about every step of what we're doing. We're able to sort of rely on instinct. We're able to sort of rely on our abilities at that point, and we don't have to necessarily be thinking about it like some of the earlier stages. Thank
Sure.
you for that. But no, absolutely, and I think there are a lot of important takeaways, and the authors provide some really helpful tools. Things that stem from certain basics, like watching the ball. Right? I think probably every tennis player has
Yeah.
been told that, or every tennis player has probably tried to do that at some point. But offering some specific tools in terms of how to do that. Things like zooming or scanning. Zooming sort of being like really trying to zoom in, really trying to, follow the ball, track the ball. And then scanning being, sort of a larger awareness of the court and your opponent and that sort of thing. So instead of just, watching or being aware or watching the ball, that sort of thing, offering some specific tools to do that. So I really liked it as well. And yeah, I appreciate you introducing me to this book because I hadn't heard of it and definitely enjoyed reading it myself.
Yeah. You just were mentioning the two parts of the four concentrations that the authors introduce, and there are some exercises around how to train those, and I've used those with some of my clients and gotten really good results um, from them, good feedback on doing these things. So the idea of
Tennis
just
D6 Donna Pino or
practice
Tennis D6 Donna Pino.
zooming for just a few minutes per day, 2 to 3 minutes per day. Practice zooming in on the ball. See it all the way from your opponent's racket all the way to your racket and then back. You wouldn't normally do that in a match because you would also be scanning the court. But by just practicing that simple skill, it becomes more automatic later. The same with scanning, noticing where your opponent is placed on the court, where you are on the court relative to the baseline. Um, there's also feeling, this idea that we talk a lot about, Josh, is understanding your relaxation tension state. So there are some exercises you can do around just tuning into, all right, how tight is my grip? How tight is it on the backswing? How tight is it at contact? How tight is it at follow through? What am I doing with it between points? And just getting people to tune into their bodies a little bit more. And again, doing this just for 2 to 3 minutes a day starts to build that consistency in which you notice tension and you're able to release it better just by the fact of you've made this part of your warm up each day. And so those exercises with clients have been really very, very helpful. And like I said, good feedback on those. So I think that was one area. And you were also referring, Josh, a little bit to what they have, these 6 pillars: friendly eyes, good mistakes, curiosity, self-knowledge, self-discipline, and acceptance. And there's obviously a bit of mindfulness in there, but the friendly eyes, though, I think is a good way to first look at this, because that's actually what Jackie Reardon now calls her business. And it's this idea of looking at everything you do with friendly eyes, being more compassionate rather than looking at everything with such a critical and judgmental view. Realize that you're probably trying your best, so why wouldn't you be kind to yourself? Looking at mistakes as good mistakes, or understanding that what a good mistake is. When you're trying to do the right thing, can't always expect to be totally proficient at it right away. So understand how to make good mistakes. I think curiosity and self-knowledge go together. Being more curious about your game, more curious about yourself, and trying to build self-knowledge through that process, right? The more that you can know about yourself and master yourself, the better. Um, Self-discipline, I think, is a lot about consistent habits, developing those habits. Um, and then finally, acceptance of reality, acceptance of what is. Um, and how that these 6 things, they call it their 6 pillars, how important they are, to the foundation of a good mental game. So I thought those, along with the 4 concentration areas, were some of the bigger points from the book. And I think from a practical perspective, the 4 concentration areas scanning, zooming, feeling, and thinking. We didn't talk so much about thinking, but that those were ones that I was able to really use directly with players that I work with, and have seen, just based on feedback from them, some very good results there.
Absolutely. And I think they're really, really important tools. I think the feeling piece, and I think particularly the body awareness piece is, I think there's different ways to build that, right? There's things like meditation, there's things like body scans, trying to be aware of both your own body and both what's happening within you, and trying to notice, okay, maybe where am I feeling tension? And then there's things like progressive muscle relaxation that can be learned and developed, where you can where you can start to release some of that tension as you're feeling it. But yeah, so the awareness of what's going on within you, but also other sorts of other sorts of feeling, right? Things like, how is your grip in your hand? How tight are you feeling it? Can you feel the ground under your feet? We did an episode a while ago, probably right around, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, with Jeff Greenwald, who talked about this concept of, in between points, trying to really connect to that tactile sense, and trying to connect to that feeling of your feet under the ground, right? We generally have our feet on the ground, but how often do we really notice that? But yeah, trying to notice the tension that how we're gripping the racket, especially if we're feeling a little tight, a little nervous. People tend to grip the racket tighter. People tend to sort of choke the racket. So I think, yeah, through some of these different exercises, we can start to really build important skills in terms of, some of these key concepts in terms of, how we, sort of our body awareness on the court, how we're, aware of the dynamics of the match and the positioning of people in terms of that scanning component. And then in terms of watching the ball, which is, has been said to be, the most, or one of the most important things that you really can do, in terms of, watching the ball that's coming towards you. Sounds very basic, but in terms of what I liked about this is it really provided some basic tools that people can use. And Brian, I know you mentioned that idea of friendly eyes. To me, really what it is almost giving yourself the benefit of the doubt, trying to see things through this lens of, seeing things of, giving yourself the benefit of the doubt, being able to, assume best intentions, assume that you're trying your best. You're trying to do your best in each situation. And if you make a mistake, that's not a result of you failing in some way. You're going to make mistakes. And, they talk a lot about this concept of good mistakes, but, just understanding, okay, that's what happened. I missed the shot. Can I learn from it? Can I adjust? And can I move on? Rather than, I think, the way that people tend to see mistakes with sort of this, through this judgmental and rather emotional lens.
Yeah. You earlier mentioned also, Josh, the difference between story thinking and action thinking, which we should probably explain, because it does from those words doesn't necessarily make it super clear what is being discussed there. But so there are two types of thinking, one being more problematic than the other. And so the authors talk about story thinking, which really tends to be more about focusing on what's going wrong, what the problem is at the moment. And oftentimes when we do that, we start to create a story in our mind of things that could happen as we continue to focus on the problem. So like, oh, I'm missing my forehand today. I'm not going to win. I'm definitely going to lose this match. My UTR could go will go down, or my rating will go down, or something will happen, right? You start to spin it into an entire story. And when that happens, now of your ability to focus, the thinking part begins to take up almost too much mental processing space. Because it's we're not like supercomputers. We only have a certain amount of a focus ability, and now we're taking some of that away from our ability to scan and zoom and feel, and it's going a little bit too much into thinking. So we're overthinking a lot of times when we're in that story mode. where we want to get to is what is referred to as action thinking, which I like to think about as almost like solution thinking. To me, I almost look at it problem solution. She calls it story action. And I think the good thing about action is it gets you to do something. Um, but in action thinking, we're not talking to ourselves so much, and we've discussed that a lot on the show, on how when we're using productive self talk, it tends to be short. It is not it's not like a long speech. It's very much kind of do this, do that, you got this kind of thing, and that's where they're going with action thinking, and that becomes a much smaller kind of slice of the pie of your focus ability. Ideally, that's probably 10 to 15% of what is happening in the match, and the rest of what you're doing is dedicated toward scanning, zooming, feeling, and some of the other skills that we need to do, like our routine, etc. And really bringing it down to what you can control. And so by minimizing that amount of thinking and placing our actions on our disciplined habits, the idea is that we can play much better. And so I think understanding how thinking fits into the overall equation, and that it is something that we want to make sure we don't go into overthinking, is an important concept here. And I thought that was well presented in the book.
Absolutely. No, I like to think of it as sort of that problem solving,
Yeah.
where we're focusing on really what we can do, what's in our control, what can we do, right? We can, if we're thinking about those things that are controllable, it might be our routine, right? How we spend time between points. It might be, me being aware of my opponent's strengths and weaknesses and trying to maybe design a game plan around that, right? If they have a weaker stroke, okay, how can I make them hit more of that? If they have if they struggle coming into net, can I bring them to net, etc. But trying to focus on, what else can I really take action with? What else can I control here? My footwork, my how I reset, how I spend time during changeovers. I know she talks about a specific way to breathe during changeovers, which is sort of trying to use diaphragmatic breathing, trying to breathe, sort of in and out of expanding and contracting the stomach, breathing in through your nose, slowly breathing out through the mouth. But she talks about doing that during changeovers. So sort of focusing on those controllable factors within a match is sort of that action thinking. And how can I problem solve? What can I actually do in this situation, rather than that problem thinking, or sort of that story thinking, where we're very focused on what's going wrong. Maybe it's my ground strokes aren't working so well, or I'm not serving my best, or I'm focused on a line call that my opponent made last point or 5 minutes ago, or whatever the situation is. So I think it's an important distinction. I hadn't heard it necessarily presented in this way before, so I thought it was really really effective.
So, what have you taken away from the book, Josh, that you use with clients?
I would say that is one concept. That idea of just trying to present to athletes sort of those different types of thinking. I think that's probably the biggest. But I think just in general, I think it has shifted the way that I see the way that people think in tennis and in sport in general. So I think rather than necessarily, I know you said that you use some of the specific exercises or tools with athletes that you work with. To me, it's more sort of I guess, a paradigm shift within me in terms of sort of how I see things, and sort of how how by sort of developing this more of a mindful approach, that it can really cause people to be a little bit gentler to themselves, sort of see things with more friendly eyes, maybe give themselves the benefit of the doubt, and maybe build awareness of the ways that people are getting in their own way with how they're talking to themselves, with how they're approaching situations, with how they're Yeah, with just how they're going about things on and off the court, just sort of helping people maybe see the ways that they are getting in their own ways and helping to build that awareness as sort of a starting point.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, and I think I mentioned earlier how I've been using it more practically. I think a lot of the points that we've brought up are also things I've discussed with clients. I think it's not that some of these things were new per se; they weren't necessarily, but they're just phrased differently, and it's phrased in a very good way from somebody who has played the game. Um, but I also like the fact that Jackie Reardon took some concepts and went deeper on those, and I think that that's really helpful. That's to people like me and you, I think, especially um, because now we can also update, how we talk to clients and players in perhaps a better way. So, as you read this, were you reminded of other, books on mental training or performance, and some of the concepts from those?
I would say The Mindful Athlete by George Mumford is one that has certain similar concepts of sort of mindful awareness, of sort of maybe being kinder to yourself in certain ways. George Mumford is has done a lot of work with basketball players. He really is I would say an expert on on mindfulness and does a lot of work with meditation with athletes and basketball players in particular. So I think that book definitely has some overlap or some shared themes, I would say. But I think in general, as I said before, I think it's unique in terms of sort of its approach. So I think it shares certain certain themes with other books, but really goes about it in a unique way, which I appreciated.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that's I think why I had suggested the book to you and also to our audience because yeah, it's different, and it's because maybe the title of it makes it confusing because the other book, Mindset, is certainly very well known by Carol Dweck, and when you say mindset, that's probably the book that comes to mind for most people. Um, but this is certainly worth a look um, for players because I think it has a lot of good practical training tips on the mental game. Any last thoughts on the book, Josh?
No, I mean, I think I would recommend people check it out. Relevant in a tennis context, relevant for athletes of other sports, or for anybody, I think, because it's not a particularly long read.
No.
It's and I think it really is. Yeah, I think it really is something that can change the way that people think about their mindset and about sort of how they develop different tools um, to for their performance. I think it's very much based in some of these specific tools and gives really a unique approach here. So I would definitely definitely recommend it.
Yeah, and then the last chapter is called the Personal Success Plan, which is certainly worth looking at. It has a lot of great questions, some interesting suggestions about how to set goals and kind of plan those out as well as monitor them over time. And so I thought that I just took notes on those because it's very interesting. And goal setting is obviously a big part of what we do, Josh, but it's also something that we encourage other people to do more of to help them achieve more and just be more specific in what they want to work on in their own games or what other ever part of your life that you're setting goals in. So that's to me that was a good way to end the book, kind of their thinking on a personal success plan.
Totally. And this is the time of year
Yes.
where people tend to think about, goals, both in terms of maybe reflecting on the last year and thinking about thinking about what you set out to do in the year and how that went, what were some of the milestones, what were some of the things that were achieved. But also starting to look towards the upcoming year. And people talk a lot about resolutions, which so maybe works for some people, but I think, yeah, being able to set goals and different types of goals different outcomes that you may want, but also really the process and really, what sort of a process do you want to go about in the upcoming year? What do you want your day-to-day to look like? Are there certain changes you want to make? So I think that's really important, and I think also very timely for right now. But also, I mean, in that ninth chapter, I like that she asked the reader to think of a specific situation where you were in action thinking, and think of a situation where you were in story thinking, and sort of really describe what each situation was like, really contrast it, compare, contrast it. And I think it's a helpful exercise, for in general, for people to be able to think about when what was the situation when you were at your best, and what was that like? What were you saying? How were you talking to yourself? How did you feel? How were you viewing the situation? Were you worried about things going wrong, or were you, trying to make things, go right? Essentially, were you viewing it as a challenge or opportunity, or more as a threat? How are you viewing the situation when you're at your best, but also, well, when you're not at your best, when things didn't go as well? What caused that? What did that look like? Can we compare and contrast and try to learn from that? So I think that in general, that's good advice, or a good practice. And I like that they suggested a version of that, a version of that, sort of by comparing a situation when you were in action thinking, a situation when you were in story thinking, and and then being able to compare and contrast from there.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, obviously, we highly recommend the book. And for those of you who are here and who will listen to the recording, um, if you ever have questions about it and want to discuss it more, we'd be happy to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So should we move on to part two? Should we move
Sure.
on to the Ask Me Anything. So we have for the three of you, Paula, Lisa, Yoav, for I think we can open up the floor at this point, and happy to hear any and all questions. Does anyone want to get us started?
Sure.
Well, I
No,
will.
go ahead,
Oh,
Paul.
go ahead.
Paul.
Oh, you guys are so good. I mean, I'm a relatively new tennis player for about this last 6 years. And my biggest thing is the mental, obviously I need to learn to get better, and I'm older and I'm very focused, but I love your podcast because my biggest issue is my insecurity and self-doubt. And, I find your podcast so helpful for me. I try to work on it. And you repeated a few things just now that myself, that dialogue, like I'm playing lousy, I'm going to lose, everybody going to think of me, as opposed to the times when I play well, and I'm reinforcing myself. So, only thing I have to say is I find your podcast so incredibly helpful, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula. That's really great feedback for Josh and I to hear. And it's exciting for you to be on this tennis journey and working on your game in such a specific way. I'm sure, hopefully that you continue to enjoy that journey more and more as you become more aware of your mental game and become more of a master of that.
Exactly. Yep. If you
And
win a few, when you win, you like it more. Let's face it, right?
Yeah.
The more
Well, you
you
have
win,
to schedule some
yeah,
matches you're supposed to win.
Yes, exactly. But thank you.
And thank you, Paula. No, Brian and I really appreciate that feedback. It really means a lot. And I think you bring up a great point also about about self-talk as you're playing. And I think it's very common. I think the couple of phrases that you use there are in line with the way that most people talk to themselves. Especially when things start not going so well. You start maybe missing shots that you're accustomed to making, or maybe you're losing, you're losing a match to somebody that you think you should be beating, or just not having your best day. And it's very easy for our self-talk to go to, why am I doing that? I'm so bad. You're going to lose this match. What are people going to think? And I think for a lot of people, maybe for most people, that's the default. that's how people are generally going about things. But I think, we want to build awareness and start to really notice and be aware and, of our self-talk and observe that self-talk and start to notice, how am I talking to myself in different situations, right? Is it that sort of self-talk that you just described, which I've certainly been there. I think probably most people have been there talking to themselves in that same kind of way. Or am I, trying to use my self-talk in an intentional way? Am I trying to use it intentionally? Am I trying to, I think there's different guidelines we can think about as it relates to self-talk. I think, one important key, and I think we've talked about this in the past, is trying to talk to ourselves like a friend, trying to think of, if there was a friend or a teammate or a family member or somebody else that had just made a mistake or just missed a shot or just, things weren't going so well for them. How would you talk to them? And for most people, it's different from how we choose to talk to ourselves. So, I think there's different guidelines and, we could certainly talk more about that or dive a little bit deeper into this idea of self-talk. But, trying to talk to ourselves like a friend is always helpful, trying to coach ourselves, give ourselves specific instructions, mental or physical instructions, like as if you were coaching somebody else, but doing that to yourself. I know we've talked about, the power of using your own name as well to sort of depersonalize the situation. So instead of saying, I need to do this, or I shouldn't have missed that shot, or what was I thinking? Being able to say your name, Josh, bend, try to get lower for the ball, or Paula, put that last point behind you, or whatever it is. But trying to use your name, where and it can feel a little bit more like you're talking to somebody else or even coaching somebody else. But I think self-talk is, we're constantly talking to ourselves, but trying to be aware of the nature of that self-talk and then getting to the point of trying to be a little bit more intentional with it really, really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's the important
Thank you.
distinction, Josh, the intentional part, and realizing that there are a couple different self-talk systems going on there. And yeah, the one we tend to listen to is the automatic self-talk system that is, not fully within our control. And then that ended up where we often listen to those thoughts or that self-talk as if they're facts, as if they actually make sense, and they often don't. And so, we had a recent MasterClass on, like a rational approach to self-talk, and that's one particular technique. But there are a lot of great techniques for self-talk, including the coach's voice using your name. So it's good. So I think Mr. Berger, you had a question.
Just yes, thank you, Brian, very much. And I can't tell you how much I enjoy your podcast every week. So
Thank
I
you.
look forward. But a question in one of the episodes in the past, you talked about the fact that a lot of times it's better to work on your strengths rather than work on your weaknesses. That goes a further, that goes long further. If you're really good at a forehand, make your forehand even better, as opposed to like having your backhand be better than it is if it's your weakness. So I'd love to sort of hear more about that.
Sure. Do you want to tackle that one, Josh, or I can take it?
Sure. I can give a couple thoughts there. I mean, I think there's a place for both. I think there's definitely a place to work on weaknesses, and I think for most people that tends to be their focus. I think there's a lot of players out there that have a weaker forehand or backhand, and for just about everybody, one side is weaker, and that tends to be their focus. That tends to be on when they're on the practice court, what they're spending time on. When they're in the match, they're worried about having to hit that shot. And so I think there's definitely a time and place to be working on weaknesses and trying to strengthen them. But I think the point is that if that's what we're constantly doing, if we're constantly trying to strengthen our weakness, we kind of end up forgetting about our strength. And we don't spend the time that's needed to really improve our strength. And our strength can really win us matches. Our strength can really be a weapon out there for us and can, hopefully win us a lot of points. So I think the idea is, we want to sort of manage that weakness and make sure it's not so much of a glaring weakness, but it doesn't necessarily have to become, our bread and butter, the shot that wins us tons of matches. But if we can manage it, maybe not beat ourselves with that weakness, but also really improve that strength. And I think if we think about top players in the world, top ATP and WTA players, we don't necessarily. Yes, they have weaknesses. Yes, and every player does. I mean, I think maybe for Djokovic, maybe it's his overhead, right? Or maybe in Federer, it was the high backhand that Nadal would pick on. But we don't necessarily think about their weaknesses. We think about their strengths, that these players have worked on their strengths time and time and time again, to the point where that strength is able to overwhelm people, overpower people, be more consistent than their opponents. And so I think the point is we don't want to forget about our strength. We want to make sure that we're actively working on it and really dedicating the ample time to working on it, rather than just focusing on our weakness too often. Ryan, what are some of your thoughts?
Couple things. I think number one, let's define a strength, maybe more from the positive psychology perspective. A strength is something you're good at, but it's also something you enjoy doing. And we tend to learn faster around things we actually enjoy doing. So we talk to ourselves in more positive ways. Let's say it's the forehand, that's my strength. Love hitting my forehand. So my capacity to improve and build that forehand is much more so because I enjoy doing it and I'm more confident in it than, say, my backhand, which might be a weakness. So that's one thing. We have actually more capacity to take that strength and turn it into a super strength. And if you look at the pros, even if you just take Federer and Nadal, for example, I mean, Federer's forehand was one of his strengths, and he hit it in a very unique way, right? I mean, his follow through wasn't over the shoulder; it tended to be this way, and he created so much spin on that ball, and he was able to hit so aggressively with that. So that was a super strength, and he did it in a way no one else did it. Same with Rafael Nadal. The way he hits the forehand is totally unique. No one has really come that close to his, revolutions per minute on the ball, and just even his follow through, etc. is all very unique. And so when we think about a super strength, it's something that distinguishes us from others. And when we start to look at just working on your weaknesses, what are we doing there? We're creating a well-rounded player, which sounds right, but it actually means we're probably going to be mediocre overall because we're not great at any one thing. We're good at a bunch of stuff, but we're not necessarily great. We don't have a specific skill set that distinguishes us from somebody else, something that we can really use to go to the next level. And I think in men's tennis, you can see this more so than on the women's side, where you have certain players who are basically a serve and a forehand, and the backhand is good enough to get it in, but as soon as they get a forehand, they're gonna rip it. This is also why we see so many players on the men's side hitting inside out forehands. They're trying to hit as many forehands as possible. You don't see that so much on the WTA. They tend to hit more, if it's on one side, a forehand, on the other side, a backhand. And for whatever reason, men and women are seemingly trained a little bit differently on that. But, some women do play the way I just mentioned. And so I think the men's game especially is really geared toward now serve and forehand, and developing those as super strengths. Obviously not for everybody. And there might be some other things that go on there. But I think the game is starting to catch up with this idea of we need a skill that separates me from everybody else. Something I do better than others that I can use to make people uncomfortable. And if I just have a standard forehand and a standard backhand, that's probably not going to be the case. I could still become a very good player. I could still become a very high level, you say Division One player or a 5-0 player, USTA. But I think you need to be thinking just a little bit differently and out of the box to go to that next piece. And I think if I recall, Josh, David Samuel, in our episode with him, talked about this idea of you work on your strengths, but you have to address weaknesses that prevent you from using your strengths. So if you're missing a particular shot or your footwork is poor, it's imperative to work on that. And of course, sometimes I know when I talk about this with clients, I say like manage is not a synonym for ignore, right? So we're not saying only work on your strengths and ignore everything else. But sometimes that's how it gets interpreted. So they obviously have, if you look at even the best players again, who have strengthened parts of their game over the years, and I would say Federer's backhand has gotten better over the years. Nadal's backhand has gotten better over the years. Nadal's serve certainly improved, say, from 2005 to 2010. And so it wasn't maybe something that they put a lot into right away, but like through slow, consistent work over the years, that tends to become better. But it doesn't need to be the 80, 90% focus of one's training. You really need to have a good sense of how do I play the game? Like, what are my weapons? I need to work on the weapons. And I need then to work on the other stuff just to make sure it's good enough. But the weapons are what is really key.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's so interesting. I never thought about it that way, that, we're trying to always become well-rounded, but to focus on the, things that are, as you just said, are, that is a strength, and keep improving that. That's just, it's simple, but it's a really good thought, which I haven't thought of before. Thank you.
Well, what are your strengths, Paula?
I guess my forehand is better, and I'm really good at the net. So I guess the volley. So I guess I need to work on that more. I'm a relatively lower level player, 3.0 or whatever, 3 point whatever. So I'm working on my overall game, but I think, the forehand and the volley and that type of thing. So, I have to work on it all, as you said, but maybe focus a little bit more on those two, two so,
Yeah, two parts of your game, and yeah, it'd be interesting
yeah,
to see what you notice after, say, 3 months of putting a little
right,
bit more effort into that.
exactly,
If those things
exactly,
become more even better, more of a weapon in your game, maybe you even enjoy playing because hey, now I'm using my forehand and my volleys more, and
right,
I'm feeling success with them,
right,
right?
exactly, right.
And I think, yeah, just being able to, um, set yourself up to use those more, right? We don't need to necessarily avoid hitting backhands or avoid hitting, other shots, but how can you try to set yourself up to hit forehands? Can you look forward to hitting the forehand or getting into the net more to hit volleys and almost like define your game around those strengths a little bit more? I think I've been guilty in the past of, maybe thinking of my game in terms of what's wrong with it or maybe perceived weaknesses rather than, acknowledging the strengths and focusing on the strengths and sort of defining it around those terms rather than defining it or thinking about it through, what areas of my game are weaker. So I think
Mhm.
from sort of an identity perspective, also it can be helpful to take more of a strength-based approach.
I think also when you take a strengths-based approach, you're creating a better relationship with yourself, meaning that when you are only focused on weaknesses or more focused on weaknesses, you're kind of focusing on who you're not, and you're not necessarily focusing on all the good stuff that you do. And so it's almost like you're more focused on your deficits. And it's difficult to feel great about your game or about who you are as a player when you're constantly looking at what's wrong or what are my weaknesses, as opposed to there are probably a lot of great things about your game. You're just choosing not to look at them. So when you look at what you're good at, what your strengths are, you're actually setting up a better relationship with yourself. It's more of an affirming relationship. I like who I am. I like this, like what I can do. And Josh, as you said, I think it's really important for every player to begin to identify a particular identity, which includes a style of play as well, and really work on that. I was talking to a player today. He's a good player, plays ITF Pro events, and he was mentioning to me that he was trying to be somebody who would do serve plus one and end points, and he realized this past fall like that's just not him. He can't do it, and he was by trying to be that player, he was making mistakes. He was getting frustrated and upset, and he figured out that all right, that's not the way I can play. I need to play points that are 7+ shots long. I need to be hitting high and heavy. And once he did that, once he just got comfortable with that's who I want to be, his results improved. He ended up winning a 25K tournament this fall. And it's all because he figured out who he wanted to be on the court. And now all his training is geared toward who I am on the court, right? If I'm going to play that style, well, here's the footwork I need. I'm going to play that style. Here's the forehand, the serve, everything that I need. Here's what I need to be working on in terms of being aggressive or getting to net. So it brings us a lot of clarity in terms of what you need to work on when you have that. But I think understanding it, and I would say one way to look at it is to understand first your strengths and then the way you like to play, and also understand the benefits of your strengths, like how they help you to win points, how they help you to make your opponent uncomfortable. So, as an example, for someone like Rafael Nadal against Roger Federer, how does he make Federer uncomfortable, or did at least in the past, by hitting that forehand cross court high into Federer's backhand over and over and over again. And naturally, that makes Federer uncomfortable. So, that right there is a clue. I need to make sure I'm really good at this high cross court forehand because of how effective that is. Look what it does. It wins me matches. It wins me points. And so I think the more we can understand how we use our strengths to make players uncomfortable, but also how we use it to create tactical opportunities is very helpful, because then you'll know exactly what you need to train, or at least you begin that process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think just being able to really think about what do I do well, and I've actually had a similar situation come up recently with a player who really has made a lot of progress the last couple of years. A lot of his UTR has gone up quite a bit the last couple of years, and is more of that sort of counterpuncher, consistent defensive player. And I think a lot of people have told him, to get to that next level, you have to be more aggressive. And so that's really where his focus has been. And I think in a certain way, he's sort of drifted from his strengths and drifted from his identity as that really steady, consistent player. And are there chances, and should he try to, at certain points, be more aggressive to get his game to the next level? Yes. I mean, I think that seems like it would be helpful, but I think, not forgetting sort of what's gotten us to this point, what we do well, what has won us a lot of matches in the first place, I think is really important.
Yeah, and again, this is him knowing who he is and what he likes to do, and being true to that. I think there's a lot that could be said of that in life as well, right? Trying to be authentic to who you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions? Any other questions? This is your opportunity.
Are you going to the Australian Open?
I am indeed, actually.
Oh, great.
Cool. I am. My girlfriend and I are headed down there in just a couple weeks, actually.
Well, it's starting in a couple of weeks, right? Except they're starting tomorrow. I can't wait for them to get going.
Yeah.
The United Cup.
And hopefully Josh will be able to record one of our podcasts from Melbourne Park.
That's great. That's great.
That'd be cool.
You got to figure out the logistics, but we'll make it. Yeah, we'll make it happen. We'll figure out something cool.
Yeah. Well, that should be a lot of fun.
Absolutely, looking forward to it. Yeah, going to the third round and quarterfinals. So, hopefully, sure, we'll see some great matches. That'll be my fourth of the 4 Grand Slams. So very, very excited for that.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Any other questions?
Do you do any like clinics, like with, 3-day clinics somewhere where you, I was thinking for my son, but like at Indian Wells last year, he went, and for 3 days there was, they had 4 people and 8 people, and they gave training. And wondered if you did any kind of a series like that anywhere.
We have talked about that idea
Uh-huh.
of doing something like that, like almost like a weekend retreat type of
Right.
thing. So, and it certainly would have an on-court component to it for sure. It would be kind of
Uh-huh.
obviously a different type of camp in terms of the amount of like drilling, but that's it's good to know that maybe somebody would be interested in that kind of thing.
Yeah, because he did the one one of the ones in Indian Wells before the Indian Wells, and it was 3 days, and it was really, there was some blackboard type of instruction, but basically it was the clinic and the drilling. And he also did one which was very good over in west coast of Florida, and it was just a lot of drills. It was only 4 guys, I think, ended up to be, but it was really pro like you doing it, and it was just really intensive, and it was good. So I thought maybe you did something like that, or will eventually, for a little bit higher level player than me.
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true, Paula, but yeah, we could certainly have. I think we have discussed it briefly, doing something like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I listen to your podcast, so I'm sure if you do it, I'll hear about it.
for sure.
Yeah, we've talked about, different ideas, including doing some sort of, retreat in the future, some sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for people that listen to the podcast, or people that are interested to, spend a dedicated amount of time to really try to focus on building this aspect of your game, right? Just like somebody might, spend try to dedicate some time to working on their serve or their footwork or a different aspect, try to, really treat the mental game in that sort of a way. So stay
Right.
tuned. Stay tuned. I'm sure there'll
We'll
be
do. We'll do.
that or other upcoming different ideas and projects.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Well, thank you
All
all for
right.
joining tonight.
Thank you all for joining, and
Yeah.
thank you, Brian, as well. I know you're not feeling at your absolute best, so I appreciate you
Aw.
soldiering on, and despite not feeling 100%, being able to join us and taking part, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really, really rely on your podcast. It's the only one I listen to for tennis. It's what I need, the mental game of tennis. And it almost always hits the mark with me with what's going on for me. So I'm a devotee.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Paula. That's great.
Right.